You are a child, perhaps no older than 7 or 8 years, shivering not just from the damp chill that clings to the stone steps like ghostly fingers, but from a profound, bone-deep fear that words have not yet been invented to name. The air here is thick with the scent of old stone, beeswax, and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet, like decay masked by too much perfume. You were brought here days ago, weeks maybe, time blurring into a gray, unending haze since you were taken from your mother, since the man with the kind eyes but rough hands lifted you onto his horse, promising warmth and food and a great honor. Honor. The word tasted like ashes then, and it tastes like ashes now. You stand barefoot on the cold floor, clad only in a thin linen shift, your small hands clasped together so tightly your knuckles ache. Before you, illuminated by flickering candlelight that casts dancing, monstrous shadows on the tapestries, sits a figure draped in silk and velvet, a face hidden mostly in shadow. But you can feel their gaze upon you, heavy and absolute. They speak, their voice soft, like rustling leaves, but it carries the weight of mountains, of law, of God Himself. They speak of purity, of devotion, of a special service, an intimacy required for health, for spiritual well-being, for the very preservation of the royal line. They speak of secrets kept within these walls, of duties performed in the deepest hours of the night, far from prying eyes. They speak of how your innocence, your clean, untouched body, is a vital ingredient in this ritual, a necessary balm, a conduit to favor both earthly and divine. You do not understand the words entirely, but you understand the cold dread that sinks into your stomach, the primal instinct that screams danger, wrongness. You understand the way their eyes linger on your small frame, assessing, calculating. You understand that the great honor is a cage, and the warmth promised is the heat of a fire that will consume you, body and soul. This is not a simple service, it is a slow, methodical dissolution, a horrifying ritual disguised as necessity, a forgotten truth buried deep within the gilded history of power. If you find yourself drawn to uncovering these hidden truths of history, the stories glossed over or deliberately erased from the standard narratives, those uncomfortable facts that reveal the true cost of power and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable injustice, then please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to join our community. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, as it's truly powerful to connect with others across the globe who share this fascination with the often painful but vital lessons of the past. The practice I am speaking of was known by various names across different European courts and noble households throughout the early modern period, often euphemistically termed the service of the inner chambers or the purity rituals. It was not a singular, monolithic institution with codified laws recognized across borders, but rather a constellation of similar, deeply disturbing customs that arose from the absolute power wielded by monarchs and high aristocracy, the vulnerable status of children, and the prevailing beliefs about purity, health, and access to the divine. It was a system where the bodies of young, impressionable children, usually between the ages of 6 and 12, were systematically procured and utilized for the most intimate personal needs of the powerful, often under the guise of maintaining the patron's physical or spiritual health, and critically, it frequently involved sexual access disguised as a necessary function of service or a peculiar form of medical or spiritual therapy. This was not the casual, opportunistic abuse that existed everywhere in history. This was an institutionalized, accepted, and even ritually mandated form of exploitation woven into the very fabric of courtly life. The systemic foundation for such a grotesque practice lay in a complex interplay of legal, religious, and social structures that rendered certain human beings, particularly children and women, as little more than property or commodities. In this era, the concept of inherent rights for individuals, especially those outside the landholding or ruling classes, was virtually non-existent. Feudal remnants lingered, where lords held immense power over their dependents, extending even to matters of life and death, marriage, and service. Children, in particular, were considered chattel of their parents or guardians, who could apprentice them, sell their labor, or even, in desperate circumstances or for perceived advantage, surrender them into service to higher powers. The doctrine of the divine right of kings and the absolute power of the aristocracy meant that their will was often law within their own domains, and the needs and desires of the ruler, however capricious or cruel, could override conventional morality or rudimentary legal protections. Furthermore, prevailing medical theories, often intertwined with superstition and spiritual beliefs, held that contact with the pure or innocent could draw out illness, purify the body, or transfer vital essence. The perceived lack of sexual experience in a child made them, in the twisted logic of the time, particularly potent for these purposes. Religious institutions, while often preaching against vice in general, were themselves deeply embedded within the power structure and reliant on noble patronage, making them hesitant or unwilling to condemn practices sanctioned by their benefactors. Moreover, the monasteries and convents sometimes served as recruitment grounds, either by taking in orphans who were then placed into service, or by religious figures facilitating arrangements between powerful patrons and impoverished families in exchange for favor or payment, framing it as an act of charity or providing the child with a path out of poverty. However perilous, socially, the rigid hierarchy of the court meant that proximity to the monarch or a powerful noble was the ultimate form of capital. Families, even those of minor nobility or gentry, might view placing a child in such intimate service, despite the obvious risks, as a pathway to influence, protection, or future advancement for their lineage. The silence surrounding the true nature of the duties performed by these children was enforced by fear, by the power of the patrons, and by the deeply ingrained culture of discretion and secrecy that permeated courtly life. Scandal was a political weapon, and those involved, both the perpetrators and the victims, had every reason to ensure the truth remained hidden beneath layers of elaborate ritual and euphemism. The system was thus self-reinforcing. The absolute power of the patron created the demand, the vulnerability of children and the desperation of families created the supply, and the structures of court and society provided the necessary secrecy and justification. The process of procurement and selection was as varied as the courts and patrons involved, but it often shared chilling commonalities. Unlike adult servants who might be hired through established networks, these children were frequently acquired through less formal, more personal channels. Impoverished families were a prime source. Agents, sometimes court officials, sometimes intermediaries with connections to villages or orphanages, would seek out families with children who fit the desired criteria. The criteria were almost always physical: youth, often specified as being prepubescent, and an appearance deemed innocent or pure, which could translate to fair skin, light hair, or particular facial features according to the patron's preference. Promises would be made: a life away from hardship, education, though this rarely materialized beyond basic literacy useful for service, food, clothing, and the immense prestige of serving a great lord or lady. A small sum of money, perhaps enough to feed the remaining family for a year, might exchange hands, effectively a sale disguised as a charitable placement. Alternatively, children might be selected from orphanages or even monasteries that took in unwanted or abandoned children, where the power dynamic was even more skewed and the children had no familial advocate. In some cases, noble families themselves might offer a younger child into service, often a less favored son or daughter, viewing it as a strategic placement, perhaps genuinely ignorant of the full extent of the duties, or perhaps willfully blind. The selection process could be disturbingly akin to inspecting livestock or choosing an object. The child would be presented, examined physically, their demeanor assessed, and the patron or their agent would make a decision, sometimes based on a fleeting impression, sometimes after a more thorough, unsettling inspection. Once selected, the children entered a world designed to erase their former identities and mold them into compliant instruments of the patron's will. This was an intense process of indoctrination and training, often disguised as education in courtly manners, hygiene, and obedience. The goal was to break down the child's existing sense of self, their familial attachments, and their innate instincts of self-preservation, replacing them with absolute loyalty and unquestioning acceptance of their new role. This was achieved through isolation from the outside world. Letters home were censored or forbidden, visits non-existent. The child was immersed entirely in the courtly environment, where the patron's authority was absolute and celebrated. Psychological manipulation was constant. They were told how fortunate they were, how many would envy their position, how their service was vital and noble. Disciplinary methods, ostensibly for teaching manners or correcting behavior, often involved physical abuse, beatings with canes or hands, forced kneeling for hours, deprivation of food or warmth, which served to instill fear and break resistance. More insidious were the rituals designed to normalize intimacy and erase boundaries. These might involve elaborate bathing ceremonies where the child was expected to participate in or witness the patron's personal hygiene, being required to sleep in the patron's bedchamber, or performing duties that required constant, close physical contact. These acts, initially perhaps framed as necessary for the patron's care or as a mark of special trust, gradually blurred the lines between service and something far darker, desensitizing the child to inappropriate touch and interaction. The isolation, the constant psychological pressure, the physical discomfort or pain, and the blurring of physical boundaries worked together to create a state of profound vulnerability and dependency, making the child pliable and less likely to resist the escalating demands of their service. They learned that their body was no longer entirely their own, but an object for the patron's use, its purpose defined by the patron's needs and desires, however disturbing. The daily life of a child in the service of the inner chambers was one of perpetual vigilance and enforced intimacy. Their existence revolved entirely around the patron. They might be required to wake the patron, assist with dressing, prepare and serve private meals consumed within the bedchamber, and perform various personal tasks that brought them into constant physical proximity. These tasks were often framed as necessary for the patron's health or comfort, assisting with medicinal baths, applying poultices, massaging limbs, or simply being present to provide a sense of calm or purity through their mere proximity. As mentioned, sleeping in the patron's bedchamber, sometimes even in the same bed, was not uncommon, justified as providing immediate assistance should the patron require something during the night, or as a way to absorb the child's purported vital essence or innocence for the patron's rejuvenation. The psychological pressure was immense. The child was always on duty, expected to anticipate the patron's needs, to be silent observers of private moments, and to maintain an outward appearance of serene compliance regardless of their inner turmoil. They lived in a state of constant fear of displeasing the patron, knowing that the consequences could range from verbal abuse and physical punishment to being cast out or worse. The physical duties themselves, innocuous on the surface, were imbued with a disturbing undertone due to the power differential and the underlying expectation of absolute access. A simple act of helping the patron bathe became a potential gateway to sexual violation. A night spent in the bedchamber transformed from a mark of favor into an opportunity for abuse. The constant performance of these duties, the forced smiles, the practiced deference, the suppression of their own fear and revulsion, took an unimaginable psychological toll. They were trained to be invisible witnesses, silent companions, and ultimately, compliant physical objects, their minds and bodies subjugated to the will of another. The psychological impact on these children was devastating and enduring. Trapped in a world where their bodies were not their own and their emotional reality was constantly denied or punished, they developed complex and often damaging coping mechanisms. Dissociation was common, a mental retreat from the unbearable present. They learned to split off their awareness from the physical sensations of violation or degradation, existing in a detached state to survive. Internalized abuse was rampant, hearing themselves constantly described as fortunate or chosen for a noble purpose, while simultaneously experiencing degradation led to profound confusion and self-blame. They might internalize the idea that the abuse was their fault, a consequence of their own perceived inadequacy or impurity, a perversion of the very purity they were meant to embody for the patron. Competition often arose between children serving the same patron or within the same household. Each child might view the others not as fellow victims, but as rivals for the patron's limited favor, attention, or even simply less harsh treatment. This competition was actively fostered by some patrons who might deliberately create rivalries or punish children for showing solidarity with one another, further isolating them and preventing the formation of supportive bonds. Trauma responses manifested in myriad ways: extreme anxiety, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, physical ailments with no apparent medical cause, and a profound inability to trust others. Some children might retreat into themselves, becoming withdrawn and silent, while others might exhibit outward compliance, coupled with subtle acts of defiance or self-soothing behaviors that ranged from repetitive actions to, in later years if they survived, reliance on substances like laudanum, which was widely available, to numb the persistent pain. The constant psychological pressure to perform a role that was fundamentally contradictory to their well-being, the expectation of absolute emotional control in the face of terror and pain, created a state of perpetual psychological war within themselves. Their sense of self, their identity beyond being an extension of the patron's needs, was deliberately stunted or erased, leaving them with a fragile foundation upon which to build a life, should they ever escape. Let us consider some composite narratives, drawing on fragmented historical accounts and the known dynamics of these power structures, to understand the lived experience more fully. There was Elara, perhaps, taken from a fishing village on the coast at the age of 7. Her family had struggled through a harsh winter, starvation, a constant specter. The courtier's promise felt like a miracle, a lifeline. She was small, quiet, with eyes the color of the sea, which the Lady Anne, a wealthy duchess known for her delicate health and eccentric habits, found appealing. Elara was brought to the duchess's sprawling country estate, a place of bewildering luxury. Her training was swift and brutal. Beatings for speaking out of turn, for not understanding instructions delivered in a dialect she barely knew. She was taught to bathe the duchess, a corpulent woman who demanded meticulous attention to her skin, believing it drew out humors. Elara's small hands, calloused from helping with fishing nets, were forced into soft gloves for applying creams and oils. Her primary duty, however, was to sleep curled at the foot of the duchess's vast bed. It began innocuously, a child for warmth, a comfort in the dark. But soon the duchess's hand would reach down, stroking Elara's hair, then her back, moving lower. The stroking would escalate into fumbling, invasive touches, accompanied by the duchess's heavy breathing and low murmurs about Elara's purity being a balm for her ailments. Elara learned to lie rigid, eyes wide open in the darkness, praying for dawn. She developed a cough, chronic and rattling, perhaps from the damp rooms, perhaps psychosomatic. She became withdrawn, speaking only when spoken to, her sea-colored eyes holding a permanent, distant sorrow. Her small hands, once capable of mending nets, learned only to navigate the folds of silk sheets and the contours of a body that both repulsed and terrified her. Her days were a blur of meticulous, intimate service, her nights a silent endurance. She existed in a perpetual state of muted dread, her only moments of relative peace, the brief hours she spent alone polishing the silver chamber pots, the metallic scent, a small, cold comfort compared to the cloying perfumes of the duchess's room. She was a living poultice, a human charm against illness and the anxieties of the aging flesh, her childhood consumed by the bizarre and horrifying needs of her patron. Then there was Laurent, taken from an orphanage attached to a monastery near Paris. He was chosen for his angelic face and clear, soprano voice, qualities valued by the elderly Cardinal Richelieu, who, despite his vows, maintained a household filled with worldly comforts. Laurent was told his service was blessed, that he would be close to a man of God, learning piety. His duties involved assisting the cardinal with his evening ablutions, reciting prayers while the cardinal was dressed, and singing him to sleep. The singing was framed as soothing the cardinal's troubled mind and easing his transition to rest, but the cardinal insisted Laurent sit on the edge of the bed, sometimes on his lap, while he sang. The cardinal's hands, adorned with rings of office, would wander, ostensibly straightening Laurent's collar or smoothing his hair, but inevitably straying, lingering in ways that made Laurent's skin crawl. The cardinal's breath, often smelling of wine and garlic, was hot on Laurent's ear as he whispered instructions, sometimes pious, sometimes disturbingly intimate, veiled in religious metaphors about spiritual union or cleansing the soul. Laurent learned to sing louder, pouring all his fear and confusion into the pure, high notes, hoping the sound would somehow fill the space and drown out the cardinal's touch. He would clench his small fists under the velvet fabric of his tunic, his knuckles white, focusing on the intricate patterns of the ceiling to avoid the cardinal's gaze. He saw other boys in the household, older ones, with guarded eyes and a cynical weariness that terrified him more than the cardinal's touch. He understood, without needing words, that this was a path they had all trod. He began to lose his voice, his clear notes cracking, failing him when he needed them most. The choirmaster, a kindlier soul perhaps, or simply concerned with preserving the cardinal's pleasure, gave him syrups and remedies, but the true ailment was not in his throat. As his voice began its inevitable descent towards puberty, the cardinal's interest waned. Laurent was no longer the angelic voice, the innocent presence. He was becoming a young man, losing the qualities the system commodified. He was transitioned to less intimate, more physically demanding tasks, fetching and carrying, waiting tables. He was luckier than some. He wasn't simply cast out. But he carried the indelible stain of his time in the inner chambers, the knowledge that his body had been used and discarded, his faith twisted into a justification for abuse, leaving him with a deep, festering wound of mistrust and shame. And consider Fleur, whose story might end differently. She was taken from her large, starving family outside Lyon at the age of 9 by an agent of the king's mistress, the Madame de Montespan, infamous for her beauty, influence, and extravagant cruelty. Fleur was selected for her striking red hair, which was fashionable at court, and her quiet, almost submissive nature. She was trained in the highly competitive and brutal environment of Madame de Montespan's household, where children were pitted against each other for favor. Fleur's role was specifically to assist Madame with her elaborate bathing rituals and hairstyling, practices believed to enhance her beauty and thus maintain her hold over the king. This required hours spent in close physical proximity, washing Madame's long hair, applying masks and oils, and enduring her volatile moods, which could swing from indulgent smiles to furious slaps without warning. Madame de Montespan believed that contact with young, vibrant life force enhanced her own beauty and vitality, a common superstition. Fleur was often required to sleep in Madame's dressing room, a small, cold space adjacent to her bedchamber, constantly on call. While overt sexual abuse was perhaps less central to this particular role than in some others, the constant physical handling, the lack of personal boundaries, the exposure to Madame's naked body and the intimate details of her life, and the underlying power dynamic where Fleur's body was a tool for maintaining Madame's beauty, constituted a profound violation. Furthermore, the proximity to power exposed Fleur to the moral cesspool of the court. She witnessed intrigues, betrayals, and casual cruelty. She saw what happened to those who fell out of favor, the swift, merciless descent into ruin or worse. She also heard whispers amongst the older servants, fragmented tales of other children in other households, of darker duties, of children who disappeared. It was these whispers, more than her own immediate suffering, that ignited a spark of understanding. This wasn't just her bad luck. This was a pattern, a deliberate system. The Madame's physician, a man named Monsieur Dubois, a pragmatic and somewhat detached figure who saw the children as medical curiosities or necessary components of his patron's complex regimen, was less overtly cruel than Madame, but equally complicit in the system. However, he held grudging respect for efficacy and was known to sometimes make quiet observations about the children's health, perhaps seeing them as tools that needed careful maintenance to serve their purpose. Fleur, observing Dubois, noted his interest in herbal remedies and his occasional quiet acts of clinical, almost impersonal, assessment of the children's physical state. This observation would prove crucial later. The consequences for children who passed through the service of the inner chambers were rarely positive, even for those who survived the immediate ordeal. Many did not survive, succumbing to disease in unsanitary conditions, malnutrition, physical violence, or simply the despair that eroded their will to live. Those who grew older, reaching adolescence, often lost the perceived purity or physical characteristics that made them desirable for the most intimate roles. They might be moved to less privileged, more arduous forms of servitude, or, if they were particularly unlucky or their patron died without providing for them, they could be cast out with no resources, no family connection, and no skills beyond those needed for a life they were now no longer permitted to live. They were marked by their service, their reputations potentially tainted by the whispers and rumors surrounding their intimate duties. For girls, this could make marriage impossible or severely limit their prospects. For boys, it might lead to a life of low-level service, their spirits broken, their bodies aged beyond their years. A grim alternative was to graduate into the oppressive class themselves. Some survivors, having internalized the brutal logic of the system, and having witnessed its power firsthand, might aspire to positions where they could inflict similar control over others, becoming overseers or agents who procured the next generation of victims, perpetuating the cycle of abuse not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of survival and adaptation to the only world they had ever known. They became the walking, breathing legacy of the system's ability to corrupt and destroy. Yet, even within such an airtight system of control and abuse, there were sparks of resistance, small acts of defiance that asserted the victim's inherent dignity and agency. Resistance could take many forms, often necessarily covert and subtle due to the constant surveillance and the devastating consequences of discovery. Simple acts like deliberately misunderstanding instructions, feigning illness, or performing tasks slowly could be a quiet rebellion against the patron's demands for absolute obedience and efficiency. Subtle sabotage was also possible, perhaps mixing up medicinal poultices, accidentally spilling valuable cosmetics, or whispering secrets gleaned from the inner chambers to other servants, creating ripples of scandal or awareness outside the immediate sphere of control. Secret communication networks might form between children in the same household, or even between different households within the court. Whispered warnings, smuggled notes, or coded language exchanged during rare public appearances allowed children to share information, offer limited support, and perhaps, most importantly, know they were not entirely alone. Gathering and hiding evidence, such as scraps of paper with incriminating notes or objects that served as proof of abuse, was another desperate act, though the ability to use such evidence was severely limited for those trapped within the system. More organized efforts were rare, but not unheard of, representing a significant escalation of risk. Formation of secret societies or small networks dedicated to mutual protection or planning future action was incredibly dangerous, but could provide a lifeline. The ultimate act of organized resistance was, of course, mass escape. Coordinating multiple children under constant watch, navigating the complex architecture of a palace or estate, and finding safe passage outside the system was fraught with peril, requiring immense courage and cooperation. Individual acts of defiance, while often resulting in brutal retribution, were also powerful assertions of will. A public refusal to perform a degrading duty, a cry of protest, or even an act of violence against an abuser, while seemingly futile, was a reclamation of agency in the face of total subjugation. Self-harm or suicide, while tragic, could also be viewed as a final, desperate act of resistance, a refusal to allow the abuser the final measure of control over one's body and fate. The retribution for resistance was swift, merciless, and often performative, designed to terrify not only the offending child but all who witnessed or heard of it, reinforcing the absolute power of the patron. Public torture and execution were not uncommon for those caught attempting escape or perceived as ringleaders of defiance. These were spectacles designed to serve as gruesome warnings, demonstrating the consequences of challenging the established order. The methods were often cruelly chosen to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Permanent physical mutilation was another form of punishment, intended to make the child permanently undesirable for intimate service while leaving them alive as a living testament to the cost of rebellion. A severed hand, a scarred face, blinding. These marked the survivor as both punished and rendered useless to the system, a walking example of its power. Perhaps most psychologically cruel was forced participation in the oppression of others. A child who resisted might be made to assist in the punishment or indoctrination of younger, newer victims, forcing them into complicity and deepening their trauma, ensuring they were permanently entangled in the system's dark work. The message was clear: resistance was not only futile, but would result in unimaginable suffering and further degradation. Returning to our composite characters, imagine the subtle resistance. Ilara, the girl with sea eyes, learned which ointments the Duchess disliked and would subtly apply slightly too much, hoping to provoke a complaint that might lead to her being assigned to a less intimate duty. A futile hope, perhaps, but an act of will. Laurent, with his failing voice, began intentionally singing off-key or forgetting lines during the cardinal's evening ritual, a small, passive rebellion against the expectation of angelic perfection. Fleur, in Madame de Montespan's household, would accidentally mix expensive perfumes incorrectly or misplace a crucial hair ornament just before a royal event, causing chaos and frustration. A tiny act of sabotage against the system that commodified beauty and enforced her servitude. For Fleur, her observation of Monsieur Dubois, the physician, proved to be a crucial pivot point, illustrating a path of the survivor's pragmatism. She realized that Dubois, while complicit, viewed the children with a certain clinical detachment rather than the pure predatory hunger of some patrons. He was interested in their physical condition, seeing them as complex biological systems that needed management. Fleur, resourceful and intelligent despite her limited education, began paying close attention when Dubois prepared remedies and recorded observations. She learned which herbs were used for sleep, which for calming nerves, which were irritants. She began to subtly interact with Dubois, not as a victim, but as a participant in his clinical interest. She would describe her own minor ailments or observations about the other children's health in a detached, objective manner, mimicking his own professional tone. Dubois, perhaps intrigued by her unusual perspective, or perhaps seeing a potential assistant, began to give her small tasks, grinding herbs, preparing poultices under his supervision. It was still servitude, still within the oppressive system, but it was a different kind of servitude, one that required her mind, not just her body. She was still a child, still vulnerable, but she was carving out a niche, exercising a limited form of agency. As she grew older and less desirable for the purity rituals, her acquired knowledge of herbalism and basic medicine, learned at Dubois' side, made her valuable in a different way. She transitioned into the role of a physician's assistant within the household, a position far from the inner chambers, less glamorous but infinitely safer. She never forgot what she had endured and witnessed. She couldn't openly rebel, but she could protect, subtly. When new, young children arrived, she would sometimes find ways to communicate with them. Small kindnesses, warnings veiled as advice, sharing remedies that might ease their physical pain or anxiety. She became a quiet, almost invisible ally within the system, a survivor who used the tools she had been given within her prison to carve out a measure of safety for herself and offer fleeting moments of respite or warning to others. This was not triumph, not escape, but a form of pragmatic survival, a complex existence where she remained within the system that had scarred her, but found a way to minimize her own exposure and offer limited aid to others still trapped in its darkest corners. Her arc was not one of glorious resistance and escape, but of enduring, adapting, and finding a path through the darkness, using the limited means available. A testament to the complex strategies victims employ simply to survive. The decline of the service of the inner chambers and similar institutionalized practices of child exploitation disguised as necessary service was a slow, uneven process driven by a confluence of factors rather than a sudden moral awakening. It wasn't a single event, but a gradual erosion of the legal, social, and religious justifications that had once supported it. Changing court cultures played a significant role. As monarchs' power became slightly more constrained, or as scandals, inevitably, sometimes broke through the veil of secrecy, the political cost of maintaining such overtly cruel and exploitative practices increased. While public opinion in the modern sense didn't exist, rumors and whispers could damage reputations and undermine authority, especially in periods of political instability. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, while initially impacting only a small elite, gradually introduced concepts of individual rights, even for those of lower status, chipping away at the older notions of absolute power and human commodification. Philosophers began to question the divine right of kings and the unchecked power of the aristocracy, creating a climate where the exploitation of the utterly powerless, particularly children, became harder to publicly justify, even if it continued in secret. Practical problems also contributed. Maintaining such systems was expensive, requiring constant procurement and replacement of children as they grew older or became ill. As other forms of service evolved, these archaic practices seemed increasingly out of step, less efficient than employing adult servants, and fraught with potential scandal. Legal reforms, often driven by concerns other than humanitarianism, such as standardizing labor practices or establishing rudimentary public welfare systems, indirectly undermined the structures that made it easy to acquire and control children as property. The legacy of resistance, though often brutally suppressed, also played a role. Survivor stories passed down through whispers or occasionally finding their way into memoirs or accounts written after the patron's death or fall from grace served as cautionary tales, painting a picture of the depravity involved and fostering a slow shift in public perception among certain classes. Over centuries, these factors combined to make the explicit, systematized procurement and exploitation of children for intimate chamber service less common, pushing such practices further into the shadows or transforming them into different, though still abusive, forms of servitude or exploitation. The outward rituals faded, but the underlying capacity for the powerful to exploit the vulnerable remained, merely adapting its form. Looking back at the history of the service of the inner chambers and similar practices reveals a chilling truth. Systems of exploitation are not accidents, but deliberate constructs built upon existing power imbalances and justified by cultural narratives, whether those narratives are religious, medical, or social. The courage of the victims, their small acts of defiance, their strategies for survival, are a testament to the indomitable human spirit, even when subjected to unimaginable degradation. Their stories, often erased from the triumphant narratives of kings and queens, are vital. They remind us that the glittering surfaces of history often hide profound suffering, and that progress towards human dignity is hard-won, built upon the silent sacrifices of those who were denied their basic rights. The moral lesson is stark. Vigilance is always required to protect the vulnerable. The structures that enabled such practices, the unchecked power of individuals, the commodification of human beings, the use of cultural narratives to justify abuse, are not confined to distant history. We see echoes in modern forms of human trafficking, child exploitation, and institutional abuse. Remembering these forgotten stories, acknowledging the full horror of what occurred under the guise of tradition or necessity, is not merely an academic exercise. It is a call to recognize the resilience of the human spirit under duress, a reminder of how fragile freedom and safety can be, and a solemn promise to those who suffered in silence that their pain was real. Their stories matter, and their courage in the face of systemic evil will not be forgotten. Their endurance carved the path for the rights and protections we often take for granted today. May we never forget the price paid for those freedoms, nor cease to fight against the systems that would still seek to turn human beings into commodities for the pleasure or power of others.